Hello and welcome to this section of the course, What is Compassionate Recovery? Compassionate recovery is a universal, inclusive approach to healing the spectrum of addictions. We're going to talk about a couple of things that separate compassionate recovery from 12-step, traditional 12-step model, as well as some of the things it has in common. A little bit of a review on our general course outline for this brief Getting Started course. Now, we are not going to be able to get into all of the deep details on this. We do have a book coming out in 2020, at the beginning of spring 2020, and there will be plenty of materials coming out on compassionaterecovery.net, new trainings and so forth as we approach that date. You've had my background in the instructor, go back to that. I have the background in the About Your Instructor video that I made. Should be at the top of your course outline. The 12-Step Buddhist you may be familiar with. Something that is really a pivotal statistic that came out of the 12-Step Buddhist research is that there are 22 million people, and this was back in 2009, but we also have very similar numbers in 2017 was the last study that SAMHSA did. And that's SAMSHA. It's a government agency that does addiction research. We have about 2 million people in AA at any given point for the past 30 years. This number has never really changed, never really fluctuated. So, and if you add Narcotics Anonymous on top of that, you can add another few million or even double the number. Even if you quadruple the number, there are still tens of millions of people, 10, 15, or more million people that are suffering from addiction that are not staying clean and sober in the 12-step modality. Some of them may be doing it another way. Some of them have relapsed. Some of them have died. Some of them are going back through the treatment center. So just a little bit of an idea, just to kind of give you the sense of we have that many people, 22 million people, 23 million people a year going into treatment in the government agencies only. That number is probably, who knows how much higher it is if you count the thousands and thousands of private treatment facilities. I mean, there's probably 100 in San Diego. So we know that 22 million is a conservative estimate. And the point is that where are all these people going? And how can we reach them? And how can we help? And how can we improve our reach and our net for what we can do for the recovering community. When I wrote this book, The 12-Step Buddhist, I really geared it towards going into integrating the steps of the 12-step modality with Buddhism, thinking that you don't really have to leave an AA or NA or GA or OA or whatever kind of program that you want, and you really don't. And we've just done the 10-year anniversary of this book, and we added a lot more of the trauma research and new things that have come out since then. And refuge recovery, of course, has come out since then as well, which is Buddhist. It's about Buddhist refuge. But not everybody wants to be Buddhist. So for the people who really want a more general exposure to different types of therapies, techniques, spiritual traditions, and so forth, we have compassionate recovery. The addiction tree that we're all familiar with, all of these different types of addictions that we have, from anything from worrying too much to sex and love, caffeine. But the thing is about these addiction trees and this type of thinking is that not every addiction is equal. It's very easy to say, oh, I'm addicted to Instagram, I'm addicted to this and that. But honestly, you're not really going to get arrested, are you, for doing your Instagram, unless you're doing it while driving, so don't do that. But the idea here is that there are a lot of ways that the addictive personality, the addictive nature, the addictive brain, and other ways that we can think of characterizing what addiction is. There are a lot of ways that this can manifest. And part of the problem is that when you go into a 12-step program, over a long-term period of time, you don't necessarily really get to address all of the underlying issues with the steps. I've been a member of AA since 1984. I had a brief relapse period, as I mentioned, but 34, 35 years of this, and I've had to really utilize a lot of other resources to find healing. So in my experience, 12-step is not enough. and there's a lot of different wellness type of activities that we can engage in that will help us. So, what's the point of this section of the video? What is compassionate recovery? Everybody has asked me to explain it, so here it is, a basic definition. It's a program, it's a mindset, and it's skills-based. So, as a program for compassionate recovery, we have peer-led, community-based gatherings, just like typical types of meetings that you would be familiar with. But they're based on principles and practices, not steps. So it's not 12 steps that you do in order with a sponsor, and it's not the kind of thing that you're going to have to do number 1 before you do number 2 and that kind of thing. These are a set of principles with practices associated for each one, practices that are in most cases, or at least in many cases, researched and evidence-based. Compassionate recovery will be open, voluntarily of course, for people to participate in some research as we go to find out what is effective and what may not be, different orders of things, different amounts of types of practices. But at any rate, it's practice related and it's principles related. So this is completely pulled out of any kind of tradition. You don't have to be a Buddhist, a Christian, a Muslim, a Hindu. You can be whatever you are, and you can use a principle which is connected directly to a practical application in your life. So it's also treatment center and clinician supported. The idea of what we call managed 12-step in the treatment industry is that there's a 12-step kind of version that a person would do when they go into a detox, or even not really necessarily in a detox, but a little bit longer, like a 30-day treatment program or a longer-term residential program. They're going to work the steps. Well, those steps are different necessarily than the type of AA steps, because AA, for example, is for free. Treatment costs a lot of money. AA is spiritual. Treatment is secular, unless it's a spiritual faith-based type of group, and then we have a whole specific other paradigm. So instead of having these limits and having this sort of contradiction and conflict between what's really 12-step and what's really a treatment, and when you get out of the treatment center, then you go to your NA sponsor and say, hey, I want to work my steps, and they say, you got to start all over because the treatment center ones aren't the real ones. So we have principles here that are transferable between the treatment setting and the community-based setting. So it's really a mindset as well, a dynamic, open view of what the concepts of addiction and recovery are that are really based on providing solutions. And the idea here is, if you want to talk about whether or not it's a disease, whether or not it's a spiritual malady, whether or not it's something that needs to be forced on people to do 12 steps, say for example, if they do get a DUI or they're going to go to prison and the judge says go to 12 step, well, you're forcing religion on me, some people will say. So basically we're looking at, and we're not trying to define, I'm not really personally interested in trying to define whether addiction is a disease or whether it's not a disease. I personally feel that the evidence is very overwhelming in that. I did write about this extensively. The NIDA research, the National Institutes of Health research, and there are critics of this, but leaving that discussion to the side right now, rather than splitting those hairs, we can just say, hey, look, people are suffering, people are dying. What can we do about it? Let's not worry about, because the insurance companies are going to be worried about a certain thing, the community is going to be worried about a certain thing, and as an addict or as someone who with a serious attachment type of issue, you're worried about a certain thing. So let's try to bring those concerns together. It's skills-based, so there's going to be 2 levels of training for compassionate recovery. Now, do you need to do a training? No. You can download a meeting guide. When the book comes out, you can grab the book. You can start a meeting. There are recorded meditations up at compassionaterecovery.net. There are a couple of meeting guides up there now. There are going to be more meeting guides put up. Those are meeting guides that work. They've been tested for over a decade. The format is pretty solid, and people really love it. So that's there now. But if you want to enhance your skills and learn more, because there's so much more to learn out there that we can directly apply to our recovery, regardless of where we fall on the spectrum of recovery. So we're going to do individual skills, which are for sort of peer-led, like the one that you're doing now, like how to start a meeting, what's compassionate recovery about, and then we're going to have clinician-based skills. So those trainings are going to be for therapists and facilities and so forth, so that they can deal with setting up a compassionate recovery model that works in their facility, and then we also have that working in the community, just like we would with any type of 12-step group. And these trainings are going to be really accessible, really doable, like the one that you're doing right now. and you'll get groups of skills. And for example, we're going to have the mindfulness training. It's going to have, say, 3 to 5 skills on it, the compassion training, the self-compassion training, and so forth. And those are going to be a little bit different for clinicians because there's a lot of science behind this, but not everybody really wants to know the science or needs to know the science in order to get the benefit of this. Just like you don't necessarily need to go to India to hang out with the Dalai Lama to understand the benefits of doing the compassion meditation. Does that make sense?